Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. By way of introduction, to get that out of the way, I was a history major in college many years ago, and I was fascinated by the topic of interwar Germany, the period between the two world wars, because I knew it had a major impact on the family history of the Wessels. And we'll get into that a little bit. So my career took me in other paths. I spent a lot of time in academic publishing and then ended up with the United States State Department, our version of the Foreign Office, where I served a couple of posts overseas. But I always had myself pegged as an amateur historian, and I always wanted to write the story of how my family personally had been impacted by the rise of the Nazi Party and all of their shenanigans. So I'm going to start with a brief summary of some of the major events that led up to the Shoah period, just to get context. And then we'll go from there into the rest of the 1930s, basically, not quite up to the war, but pretty much up till the beginning of the war in September of 39. But so let's get into that. So if I can get this to move. So just a reminder of some of the events. I won't go into detail on any of them, but in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. And a couple of months later was the first formal boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. No formal laws yet that were particularly anti-Semitic, but the writing was on the wall. It was about to happen. People knew this was all coming, that the laws would be following. And then the law for the restoration of professional service, civil service, came in as the first, where people of a Jewish persuasion were not allowed to serve in many civil service government jobs in the new Third Reich. The first dramatic episode that most people have heard about were the book burnings in May. So Adolf Hitler had been in power for about 5 months or 4 months. And then the race laws were introduced that September. And then the Anschluss, the annexation overnight of Austria, where I was born, took place in March of 1938. Just to continue our brief run through history, because major events like that are mentioned in my book, and they also shaped very much what ordinary people in Hitler's Germany, as I call it, were going through. So the Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, was in November of 38. So Hitler had been in power for 5+ years at that point. September of 39, World War II formally begins with the invasion of Poland. It gets expanded into Western Europe in May of 1940, and the Second Front opened in June of 1941. And then the Holocaust period, by most historians' records, is attributed to be 1941 to 1945. You can choose to believe or disbelieve those dates. But I'll note two things. One is that after Kristallnacht, there was a poll taken in the United States in November of 1938. And the newspapers and the American Census Society contributed to this poll taking. And they asked two major questions of American citizens in 1938. And sorry to make this American focused, but that is part of who I am. So in 1938, November, people were asked, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? Simple question. 94% of Americans at that point disapproved of the race laws that had come in and other things that they were reading about in the newspaper. The follow-up question was, should the U.S. allow larger numbers of exiles, Jewish exiles from Germany into the United States? Do we want to do something about this? 72% said no. So like many other countries in the world, um, there was a European problem, there was a German problem. We disapprove of it, but we don't particularly want to do anything about it. So there was a pro-Nazi rally held in February of 39, by the way, where the German and American Bund had a big rally and filled our Madison Square Garden with people that still were members of the American Nazi Party, or at least pro-German. And I must say that my own family was pro-German. Well, not pro-Hitler's Germany, but they were very dedicated, very proud German, now Americans. And we'll get into that a little bit. But I used the title Dilemma of Ordinary People in 1930s Germany to highlight that there are hundreds and hundreds of books that one can find, and documentaries that one can see, and stories that one can read, diaries, etc. Many of them by political elite in Germany, or the books focus on military leaders from the old German Republic, or they deal with how industrialists, the major industrialists, dealt with the Nazi Party rise. I wanted to study and to understand how ordinary people were affected and reacted. So my focus is on people like my family. My grandfather was a carpenter. My grandmother was a seamstress and a cabaret singer in the 20s Germany, just by coincidence. Some of my other aunts and uncles, or great aunts and uncles rather, were a bricklayer, a brick maker, worked in a brick factory. We had a fishmonger in the family. We had an upholsterer. We were kind of nobodies on the political, economic, social, military front, but we were ordinary Germans. And as I said, we're like most people, we were proud to be, even after World War I, the family was very proud to be German. We later became proud to be Americans, but we'll get into that. So the question that I always focused on is, what did ordinary people know what was going on during these historical events in the 1930s? And then what did they think about it? But were they just bystanders or participants? I grew up. My screen is different than yours. Okay. I grew up wondering about my grandparents and my great uncles and aunts and other cousins. Were they bystanders? Were they participants? Were they victims? I needed to know that to know who I was. So that's what my personal study stems from. But then when it comes back to the people who were there, my family members included, what could they do about what they felt and heard? And then finally, what did they do, if anything? So let me verify that my own family had a range of choices to the Hitler takeover of their democracy. And we'll get into that. So let me introduce my family to you, just enough to become part of the story. My opa, my grandfather, as I said, was a carpenter. He was one of 8 children, born into a family of fishermen, factory workers, tradesmen, in a little hamlet near the North Sea. And my oma, grandmother, was one of 14 children, all to the same set of parents. But she was 8th. My grandfather was 6th in the birth order. My grandmother was 8 or 9, we're not sure, out of the 14. And she was born in a small village just outside of Hamburg. So both are North Germany based. My father, let's make sure that's appearing right, Karl Heinz Wessel, was their firstborn son. So he was born in 1923, 10 years before Hitler came to power, in the village of Westerzoden. They had made their home there, which is halfway between Hamburg and the coastal town called Cuxhaven. So along a river, a major river that led from the ocean to the port of Hamburg. My grandfather had a little difficulty in the economy in 1923, 4, 5 in Germany as a carpenter. And he knew as the sixth son in the birth order, he was not going to be inheriting an estate. My grandmother had no claim to any family fortune because not that there was much. Well, there actually was. Her parents ran the local butcher shop in their village. They owned a large family farm and had a huge crop or a huge number of cattle that my grandfather could then butcher. And then they bought a market next door to it to sell other food products. So he was a fairly well-to-do within the village businessman. But none of that was going to be my grandmother's. There were male children, first of all, and there were far number of children between her and her grandparents. So my grandfather and grandmother decided it was time to try moving to the United States. And they did that. There's their home in Westerzoda. So in 1927, when my father was 4 years old, they decided to leave to the United States. And I'll get into that. But first, I'll be sharing with you, in addition to my own family story, a synopsis of some of the many books by a variety of historians that I've read over the years, books that shaped my understanding of how ordinary people, including my family, dealt with Hitler's rise. So I'll be referring to The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Steyer. That's probably one of the best known books. I don't know if it's part of the reading curriculum here, but many American high school students back in my day, as part of our public schooling, were required to read this to get a World War II history, or just pre-World War II's history. But I'll be also referring to several other books that I think provided major advances in the four questions that I asked. What did ordinary people know? What could they do? What did they do about Hitler's takeover? I should note that all of these books deal with the major historical events of the book burnings and Kristallnacht and the annexation of Austria. But each book reflects the time in which it was published and the time in which the author studied and came to their conclusions about how ordinary people responded to the Nazi Party's growth. So let me get into some of those. We'll start with the one just 15 years after the end of World War II. William Shirer, he had been an American war correspondent with CBS News in Germany, and he reported from Berlin until 1940. So well after the Anschluss, and well after the beginning of the war in September of 39. He left Germany in 1940. And he wrote to all the millions of discontented, and sorry, I don't have all this up there, but Shirer concluded that to all the millions of discontented folks, Hitler, in a whirlwind campaign, offered what seemed to them, in their misery, some measure of hope. He would make Germany strong again. He would refuse to pay reparations that had come from World War I. He would repudiate the Versailles Treaty. He would stamp out government corruption and social rot and see to it that every German had a job and bread. That was his claim to fame when he was becoming the man in Germany. On the subject of how responsible ordinary Germans might be for the calamity which followed, Shirer wrote that no class or group of Germans could escape responsibility for the death of democracy within their country. So they all had a shared social guilt. Shirer went on to say, and here I'll quote, "At the crest of their popular strength in July 1932, the National Socialists had attained but 37% of the vote. But the 63% of the German people who expressed their opposition to Hitler were much too divided and short-sighted to combine against a common danger which they must have known would overwhelm them unless they united, however temporarily, to stamp it out." So It's not all that surprising that just 15 years after the war, a historian, war correspondent who had been there up until 1940 would lay a fairly heavy common social guilt upon the German public, including all the ordinary people. Scheirer, who had lived there in Germany during the early years, also said that one who has not lived for years in a totalitarian regime would have difficulty conceiving how difficult it was to escape the consequences of living under such a regime and its incessant messaging and propaganda. So he wrote, one realized how useless it was to even try to make contact with a mind which had become warped and for whom the facts of life had become what Hitler and Goebbels, with their cynical disregard for truth, said they were. So he sort of explained that everybody had a shared guilt, but that's because they were just totally inundated with the messaging of the day. Addressing the subject of anti-Semitism in particular and the Holocaust activities in particular, Scheirer wrote that it is important to recall some history, that the influence of the Protestant religious leader Martin Luther, who was himself very anti-Semitic, believed in a strict adherence to authority. So Germans, by trait, were ready to buy into authority figures. Scheirer goes on to tell us that Martin Luther, and quoting this, wanted Germany rid of the Jews, and Martin Luther advised that they be deprived of all their cash and jewels and silver and gold, advice that was literally followed 4 centuries later by Hitler, Goering, and Himmler. End of the quote. So it's worth noting maybe that according to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. at this time, Germany was 2/3 Lutheran. So they're under the influence of Martin Luther quite a bit. My own family being very much Lutheran back in the day. Then we jump from that book to one written in 1985 by Joseph Peter Maria Stern, a scholar who was born into a Jewish family and served in the Czechoslovakian resistance movement during World War II. And he asked the primary question of his book, what did Germans know of the atrocities that were perpetuated in their name? And as you can read, Stern wrote that up until the time of his writing, some 40 years after the Second World War, there could not yet be a definitive good assessment of that question outside of wholesale accusations like Scheirer had done, and emotional denials that everyone was just following orders. So there were starting to be 2 camps in the what year did I say this came out? 1988. We saw 2 camps of all Germans were guilty of some collaboration, cooperation, contribution to the Nazi effort, or everyone was just doing orders. Those were the 2 major arguments at the time, that nobody really had any choice because we're just following orders. And again, German society was prone to some acceptance of authority figures. So Stern went on to say that he could not foresee that there would ever be an answer to the question of how ordinary people, how much they were involved with and bought into the Nazi propaganda or the Nazi activities. Stern did, however, offer 2 opinions of his own. One, that there's enough evidence to indicate that detailed knowledge of Nazi programs oriented to the elimination of the Jewish population was generally hidden from German citizens. It was hidden for as long as possible from the victims themselves. He accepted and proposed that there was plenty of research to that effect, detailing that the detailed knowledge wasn't there. But that there was equally abundant evidence to indicate that everyone would have some level of knowledge that there were mass arrests, that there were mass deportations, and yes, mass killings. That knowledge was available to anyone and everyone who was paying attention, is what he proposed. Stern also pointed out that the Nazi Party itself wanted everyone to be aware of their activities to some degree, because that would help keep the general population in line. And again, if the society has become quite militaristic and the various police organizations are watching everybody's activities, and oh, by the way, there are consequences that we know about, but you don't need to know all the details, but that's enough to keep the population of ordinary folks in line. But in 1988, it was still too early, said Stern, to say for sure just how much ordinary people knew or acknowledged what was going on. They could still only conjecture about what ordinary folks like my family might have done about these atrocities. Moving on to 1996, we saw the publication of Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. He was a former associate professor of government and social studies at Harvard University, so he had his academic credentials quite verified. And he put forth the rather controversial argument that stated quite simply that many thousands of Germans, most Germans, were moved to support the Nazi effort based on a deep-seated endemic anti-Semitism. That it was not a matter of economic hardship, not the coercive means of the totalitarian state that they were living in, not social psychological pressure, not the invariable psychological propensities of the German people, but socially accepted and universally endorsed ideas about Jews that were pervasive in Germany and had been for decades. Goldhagen argues that throughout in his lengthy book, he argues that Germans were by nature anti-Semitic, which, knowing my family, I find a little hard to accept. But that really encouraged me even more to understand, okay, how was my family involved with all this then? Were they hardcore or, in bottom line, anti-Semitic? I needed to know this. And from the time that I knew my grandparents, and certainly I knew my father, after my grandparents left Germany, it's as if that it did not exist. They did not discuss why they left, when they left, how they left, any of the circumstances. That was just not a topic for discussion with their grandchildren. My father would only discuss this from what he recalled. Again, he was 4 when they left in 1927. He couldn't recall it. He would not relate to me how his parents described or what he thought about what was going on in Germany. Again, so I had to study this. If they're not going to tell me, I'm going to figure this out on my own. Goldhagen argued that anti-Semitism was, in fact, part of the social DNA. And his explanation is he called ordinary Germans perpetrators. His explanation was that ordinary Germans were animated by a particular type of anti-Semitism, one that led them to conclude that, in fact, Jews ought to die. So again, I beg to differ with Dr. Goldhagen just a little bit, but his book brought the argument and brought the discussion back into American society when it had been sort of left dormant for a while. So he made that contribution. I skip forward to 2005, to the current millennium, and a seemingly more balanced view of the question about how ordinary Germans viewed Hitler and his gang, from British historian Richard Evans, Sir Richard Evans now. who wrote of the belief, especially popular in the far-right political parties, that Germany lost World War I because it had been stabbed in the back by the activities of communist traitors and Jews within Germany. So the two responsible parties, really, not the German military and its own decisions, but communists and Jews, which he conflates, were conflated in the minds of the public. So Evans argues that this translated quite easily into accepting the Nazi Party's anti-Semitic rhetoric. And it got heightened as more and more Jews fled from pogroms and hostilities in Russia or Poland and entered Germany. Many people feared that Germany would continue its post-World War I economic problems. Evans goes on to say that the sensibility of many Germans was so blunted by the tide of anti-Semitic rhetoric that they failed to recognize there was anything exceptional about this new political movement of the Nazi Party that emerged at the end of the war, a movement that put anti-Semitism at the core of its fanatically held beliefs. Then we skipped 9 years later, a relatively unknown book, but I happen to know the author. 11 years ago, or 21 years ago now, I guess, or no, 15 years ago. What's 2014? So 12 years ago now. I have to update my slide. An American scholar, Dan McMillan, who is a political activist in New York, took up the subject again of what ordinary people, what ordinary Germans knew and what they felt about Hitler's Germany. And he offered a modern perspective on explaining the Holocaust. He wrote, "The anti-Semitism of most Germans, those who belonged neither to the Nazi Party nor to the country's elite, was surely much milder than the Nazi version of anti-Semitism." And Macmillan argued that for most Germans, their prejudice might only have been that German Jews, especially those who had come from Russia or Poland, were not really Germans at all, not Germans at heart. Macmillan went on to say, even such muted prejudice against now German Jews was enough to let Germans who had been in Germany for centuries react with indifference, if not anti-Semitic, at least indifference, as their Jewish neighbors were persecuted in the 30s and then later murdered in the 40s. Macmillan concluded, reflecting a generally accepted opinion, that ordinary Germans of the 30s and 40s were not really different from who we are ourselves. He wrote that it was not some deep and widespread flaw in the German national psychology, but rather accidents of history and partisan strife that combined to make Hitler's rise to power possible and the loyalty of millions to him a reality. Macmillan also pointed out that when Hitler first came to power, there were relatively few Jews in Germany before they started coming in from the invaded countries. So it's a very small population. The village that my grandparents were from, to the best of the research that I've been able to do, because most of the Jewish population that was in Germany was in the major cities, not out in the small villages. To the best of my research, I found one Jewish family in the town of Westerzoda that my grandparents were from. And that was a family of 4 or 5 people, maybe, parents and children. And this was a fact that Goldhagen himself had pointed out in his book, that less than 1% of the German population was Jewish. And that most of those lived in the large urban areas. So even Goldhagen noted that the hardcore anti-Semites in Germany probably had little or no contact with anyone who was Jewish. Like my grandparents. They might have known that one family. I believe they did, but I have no proof of that. Despite this, Dan McMillan reminds us that even though ordinary Germans weren't necessarily familiar with anybody who was Jewish, tens of millions made the moral choices that we now find just impossible to imagine. But as Evans pointed out, back in Hitler's early days as chancellor, many Germans thought the National Socialist Party would soon pass. They had gone through so many chancellors, so many political powers taking the political realm, so many changes in national leadership that they started out thinking that Hitler and the National Socialists would soon lose their power as well, and we could move on back to who we as Germans really were. So some people in despair for their country did choose to leave. That's not particularly why my family first left in 1927, because that was an economic decision for a young carpenter trying to raise a family. But those who chose to leave in the early days of the Nazi Reich, if they had the means and opportunities, which shrunk over time, chose to do so, but many chose not to, even though there was some shock to it. Those who chose to stay thought their chances of the Nazi Party dying or the renewal of a democratic Germany coming back were at least tolerable chances, believable. As Evans wrote, when it comes to the choice, the dilemma that ordinary people had if they were considering Germany, leaving Germany, is that people make their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. And Evans went on to say, those conditions not only include the historical context in which one was raised and lived, but also the way in which they thought and the assumptions that they made about change that would inevitably occur. And it's based on the principles and belief that form their behavior. So it became really an individual choice, leaving me as a kid, a student in my college days, wondering, okay, so how did my parents and grandparents or my grandparents think? What did they believe? What did they assume was correct? And what would they do about it? Post-college, for me, quite a bit, is a new book, or a relatively new book in 2018 by Dr. Benjamin Carter Hett, one of the most recent comprehensive studies on the rise of Adolf Hitler and the downfall of democracy in the Weimar Republic. Richard Benjamin is a Hunter College professor, teaches also at New York University. And he wrote that the Nazi Party was not only anti-Semitic, the party was, but the Nazi Party was anti-everything, anything that spoke of order being established. So they were anti-liberal, anti-conservative, anti-religious, anti-atheist, anti-capitalist, anti-socialist. Just, it's hard to tell what they're for, but easy to figure out what they were against. And of course, anti-Semitism would have just been a part of that, according to Dr. Hett. He went on to say that very few Germans, even those discontent with the economics and social political realities of the Weimar Republic, actually wanted to see their democracy replaced by a barbaric dictatorship. Nobody wanted that. They simply wanted the fastest and easiest solutions to their own particular problems. So like you and me, or at least like me, they wanted to raise their children to be nice, behaved, normal, moral children. They wanted those children to have an economic future better than what they had. I've always wanted that for my children. They should have a better economic life than I've had. But in the meantime, they're also concerned with feeding those children, keeping them clothed, keeping their own jobs going, taking care of the healthcare needs of the family, maintaining the property they lived in, et cetera, et cetera. So distracted, ordinary people would have been distracted like many by day-to-day life concerns. There's a new book, and I've rushed to put this in here this week because I've just come upon this book that came out in March while I was here on vacation. It's new. I'm not done reading it yet, or I'm listening to it on Audible. So I can't really tell you exactly where it's going. But this is by Ian Baruma, who is from a Jewish base. His heritage is a Jewish family that was in Berlin during the war years. And he doesn't really focus on all of Germany. He doesn't, but he focuses on ordinary people within the capital of the Third Reich. Baruma's father was a Dutch student who was forced into labor at the Berlin brickworks, and then later forced labor in an arms manufacturer for the Nazi Party. And he points out that in the latter part of the period that he's concerned with, 1945, the German greeting "Grüß Gott," good day, happy God, good morning, or Guten Morgen, or as people were saying back then, Sieg Heil, was replaced in Germany in 1945. The most common greetings that people used were, I should have written it down because I don't have it in German, but they said, "Stay alive." But pass each other in the street. The bombings were occurring. The war was a reality. It had come hitting close to home for them. So he said his father he recalled the most common greeting walking down the street to see somebody was, "Stay alive, make it another day." But so far, what I've gathered from listening to his book, he draws on diaries, letters, and memoirs. It's largely about his own family, but also everything is based on original source material, as historians call it. And he chronicles the daily life in wartime Berlin. And as one reviewer said, with extraordinary power and immediacy. And he illuminates how ordinary people navigated the moral catastrophe of the Third Reich, especially towards the end, and what it meant to resist, what it meant to conform, or what it meant simply to endure, if that's what one's choice was. I will mention that he introduced two alternatives to people that were living through and objected to the Nazi Party, but ended up staying, whether they chose to stay or just didn't have the opportunity and means to leave. A lot of people in what Baruma is saying use the term for themselves. They were unpolitisch. They were not political. So they're just above and beyond, outside of German politics. They cared more about sports or religion or their day-to-day life or agriculture or whatever. What was going on politically was relatively unimportant to them. And then he also introduces a new term, which I had not heard before, called inner emigration. He seems to, from what I've heard so far, he argues that the people who left many of them did not emigrate from Germany. They were exiles. Emigration to him implies choosing to leave, that because they want to, and choosing where to go if they did leave. Like my family emigrated, but many people that stayed and had to end up trying to stay alive were more inner emigres. So they were in the country of Germany, but sort of withdrew from caring or from direct contribution and collaboration. So his book, according to one reviewer, shows how society's accommodation to evil unfolds one small compromise at a time. Okay, I can live with this step. I can live with this step. I can live with this one, until the descent reaches its bottom. So I highly recommend. I'll be continuing to listen to that on the train back to Para Umu a little bit from now. So this brings me back to the questions I posed to begin with. But having covered the first two questions and seen some nods and some, I'd like to pause to ask for your own thoughts before I go any further on the next question is, well, first let me ask if anyone here has relatives who were living in Germany or Austria, the German Empire, during the 1930s, just out of curiosity. So one hand, couple of hands up here. I don't see any hands from the people on Zoom, but thank you for that. So I'd like to then ask, from your understanding, from what we know or what you know, what could ordinary people who had no political connections, no military connections, no industrial strength, parents, what could ordinary people have done and what did they do? Anyone want to volunteer? We'll get the microphone to you if so.
Well, just very briefly, as Jews, they left. Those that could, those that couldn't were murdered.
Right.
Camps.
That's pretty short response. Anyone else? Okay. Well, we'll get into what my focus on this was, what did ordinary people do and what did my ordinary people do and how typical was that? So, and I'll put down four, or I'll propose that there were four major reactions, but basically one could, on one hand, totally commit to the Nazi Party, join the Nazi Party, join the SS if you were a young male, fight for the glory of the Third Reich, as they might have said at the time. And all the way at the other end would be, I am going to do whatever possible I can to show that this is just wrong, and be totally resistant. The resistors would have, depending on where they were, if they were able to leave, maybe they would do so. If they were not able to leave, didn't have the opportunity, didn't have the means, could still resist. And so we'll go through the four steps on that continuum, but it really is a continuum. I think of it much as the degrees on a compass. You can go north, south, east, west, or north, northeast, or south, southwest. There are variations and degrees between those four compass points. But I propose there were basically four points. So some people did choose to endorse the party and build what this glorious Third Reich that they heard about was going to be, restore Germany to its proper place in the world. People could choose to comply, sort of, okay, I don't quite get this. I'll go along with it because I can't do anything about it. I'm just an ordinary person. I'll fall in line. Because it is expected, I will have my children join the Hitler Youth or the BDM, the female version of the Hitler Youth, or because it is expected and I am a good German, I will join the Wehrmacht when either because I get drafted or because I just, okay, Germany's in a war, I'm a good German, I'm going to fight for my country. So they would comply with the politics. They could resist. Again, most of what we see and hear in the news stories and documentaries and books of resistance were outside of Germany, not inside Germany. But again, it would be pretty hard to resist everything that was going on, all the pressures that one had inside German borders. But there was some resistance, the White Rose being probably the best known. Or they could totally reject it and leave. So I kind of see that as 4 points. Those who early on had some opportunity, and those who, despite the costs of departure and the immigration taxes that were involved, had the means to, would readily go to the United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, South America, wherever they could go. They faced a difficulty, as we said, 73% of Americans were saying, yeah, we don't really need to raise the limits of Jewish immigration in the United States. So then there's a great summary on the difficulty of if one wanted to choose where on this perspective they fell. Recounting the experiences of individuals brings home to Richard Evans, as nothing else can, the sheer complexity of the choices they had to make and the difficult and often opaque nature of the situations that each individual confronted. And perhaps this quote is part of why I'm so attracted to every story I've read, every documentary I've seen about different circumstances leading different people to make different decisions. Evans does go on to point out that ordinary people living through these days could not see things the way we see them now. They don't have the hindsight that we could see. They did not know in 1933, when Hitler came to power, what was going to happen in 1939 or 1942 or 1945, any of that. So it's a good reminder that if we want to make our own assessment of how people made their choices, whether they were good choices or bad, they don't have the same hindsight that we now have. And I love his conclusion that if they had known, if they'd had that hindsight, doubtless the choices they made would have been very different. Now, some people argue with me on that. They may or may not have had a different, even if they knew what was about to come, they still might have made the same choice. I sure hope that most people, and I've come to firmly believe that my own family would have made different choices. But even in talking to some of my relatives, you'll hear that some of my family stayed. And on that continuum, the Wessels were out there. Some of them were out there. I would hope that if they knew what was about to result from it all, that they would have made a different choice. So let's talk a little bit about my own family story, because I think my family represents in microcosm the range of choices that the German public faced back in those days. And I've tried to capture them in my book, and I've certainly captured them in my heart and how I view the dilemma that ordinary people in 1930s Germany made their choices to the best of my ability. So my book is a combination of a little bit of history, but it is fiction. But that fiction is based on family lore to the best of my ability that I could document or verify. So if I heard a story, did my siblings also hear that story? Or how did that jive with my relatives still in the Hamburg area in what they heard about those events? Because I have the blessing of being still in touch with about 5 of my extended family members. Again, if my grandmother was one of 14 and my grandfather was one of 9, that's 23 siblings in the 2 families. So that gives me 21 aunts and uncles before they got married. So let's call it 46. And if they all had as many Wessels descendants as my family did, multiply that by 6, you got a ton of Wessels or Hornbussels, my grandmother's maiden name. So the book is based on family lore and stories with some fiction on things that I just never could figure out how to make sense of it all. So it tells the story of my grandfather. One of them is my grandfather's brother. So he'd be my great uncle Ernst. He was a minor Nazi official way out here on the right side of our family, who would proudly march alongside his Führer and raised his children in that level of thinking. His son, So Peter would be my father's favorite cousin, my great cousin, I guess, was pulled into that web by his father, Ernst, and by his participation in the Hitler Youth. From one of Peter's letters to my father, I get a glimpse of the attraction that the Fuhrer had for Ernst, who in 1935, I guess he'd been born in 1920, so he's about 15 in 1935. And he wrote to my father, I remain quite busy with my schooling, and I'm sure that Herr Hitler will do all the things that he has promised us. So my book also tells the story of my great uncle Richard in the compliance side of the family. Richard was known as Fish Wessel by everybody in the community. He would get up every morning, 6 days a week, and ride his bicycle 16 kilometers from their village to the Cuxhaven Harbor docks, buy a load of fish, and then on the way back, stop at his regular customers and sell his wares. So he was called Fish Wessel. And he carried on these fishmongering during the war and tried his best to just ride out the Nazi era, hoping for its eventual collapse. Pretty much just keeping his head low and keeping out of it, other than helping that one Jewish family that was in town. When I discovered this story, it was just, it was fun to hear. So immediately after Kristallnacht, Ari Epstein, the Jewish baker in town, and his family left for Denmark. He was a storekeeper with a bakery across the street from my family's butcher shop. So Ari's family decided to go to Denmark to get away from the Nazis in Germany. And my Uncle Fish stored their personal possessions, the silver, their dishes, their paintings, family photographs, in his potato cellar. And there they stayed until after the war, until the Epsteins came back and got them. So other than that, I don't know that my Uncle Fish had any, he was unpolitisch other than that, but he wasn't going to let the one Jewish family he knew. That's me giving him, trying to take over his thoughts. I'm assuming he was not going to let that one family, the only Jews he knew, suffer any more than they had to. So, but otherwise, he was compliant. In terms of resistance, and here I had to fictionalize the most because I couldn't find a good record of this. I know that my father's Aunt Marguerite, who, like Hans and Sophie Scholl, people familiar with them, the brother-sister act in the Behind the White Rose. I knew that Marguerite paid the price for her resistance activities, but there really wasn't much documentation I could find on it. Minor though they would have been, she was under the watchful eye of the Gestapo and the SS and everybody else, the neighbors, growing up, but apparently chose to run off on a printing press in her village church some anti-Nazi propaganda, a little bulletin called Genug, enough. And so one of them, again, I don't have a copy of it. I've made it up in my book because this is what we heard about in talking to my family members. One of the pamphlets said, okay, everybody, if you want to comply with what's going on in the authorities, but you don't want to really participate and collaborate much, but you want to live through this thing, go to the brickworks, go to the cement factory where you work, go out into the field to raise crops for the troops. But, don't go to work on time, get there late, call in sick, whatever you can get away with. Don't, do something to break some of the machinery so you can't produce as many bricks or armaments or whatever you're doing to get along. resist in a through your labor or your lack of labor was one of her pamphlets. So, in the book, I provide one of her pamphlets as if I had found it, but that's like I say, it's historical fiction, fictionalizing that I could not prove. Sadly, Marguerite was did not survive the war and did not survive her resistance activities. We know that. So I made up the scene where she gets caught distributing some of that literature. In my approach to fictionalizing, I tried to base what I am describing as having happened as things that very logically could have happened and did happen to other people from their memoirs and documented newspaper stories. So I don't think I didn't just invent all this. But my book is mostly focused on the story of my grandparents and my father, Karl Heinz. So as I mentioned, my dad was born in 1923. They moved to the United States at the age of 4, at his age of 4. They returned to Germany 7 years later. So in 1934. So Hitler had been in power for about a year and a half. My father was 11 years old, and my great-grandparents that had the 14 kids, my great-grandfather had a stroke. And as it turns out, socially, family duties, it was expected that the oldest daughter, my grandmother, would be responsible for taking care of her parents as they were aging. So in 1934, my grandmother and my father moved back to Germany. And my grandfather stayed in the United States to wrap up business, sell his business. He had done fairly well for himself. But he had time to sell the car and sell the house and sell all the furniture in the house, etc., and move. And he had some job commitments as a carpenter. He was building some houses that he had to finish. So he would join them in 1930 and lead in 1934. So my father goes back. And he is immediately signed up to go to school, subject to the Nazi version of math, which had angles of sending bombs. When you're going to talk about angles of projections, let's talk about how that would affect launching a grenade. Let's talk about history and race politics that came into the schools, everything that was in the Nazi school agenda. So my father was now subjected to. He was put in the Hitler Youth immediately upon his arrival. He was 12 years old, or 11, 12 years old. And his cousin Peter told him how wonderful the Hitler Youth was. It's kind of like your Boy Scouts. You get to go hiking and camping and singing songs. But we also get to throw live grenades and blow things up and shoot real rifles. And to an 11-year-old boy, this is pretty good stuff. So that was the reception. But my father was seen as an Auslander, an outsider, because he had an American accent, and his German wasn't as strong as it could have been because he'd spent 7 years in Germany. So he related to me once when I finally got my father to start talking. He related one episode that I'll read just my summary of it. Karl Heinz backed out of the crowded sweet shop slowly, ever so slowly, as if that might help. He forced a smile onto his face, as if that would be enough. He made sure to close the door completely, praying that would keep them from following him. Turning toward home, he breathed a quick sigh of relief, then started to walk briskly, eager to believe the danger had passed. After a few paces, he glanced over his shoulder, hoping against hope they were not coming after him. Maybe, just maybe, they would stay inside, content that they had made their point, but such was not the case. The door of the sweet shop opened and 3 boys stepped out. They stood for a moment, laughing and admiring their reflections in the storefront window. In their starched tan shirts, black kerchiefs with brown leather slip knots, dark corduroy shorts, mid-length white socks, and leather shoes, they could be poster children for the party youth group. But then again, so could Karl Heinz. He wore the same uniform and had golden blonde hair and brilliant blue eyes. In near perfect unison, the trio looked to the right, then to the left, and then back to the right. They were looking for him. There he is, the oldest boy cried out. Let's go teach him a lesson. Karl Heinz quickened his pace, hopeful they would lose interest in teaching him anything. With another backward glance, though, he saw they were gaining on him, marching faster than he was. He sped up, going from a walk to a trot to a full-on run by the time he reached the edge of town. His pursuers matched his pace until all four boys, the hunters and the hunted, were in the open countryside. They sprinted over the one-lane bridge where the straight paved road turned into a winding path of hard-packed gravel, which slowed them down and caused their legs to strain harder. Sweat began to stream down their foreheads and darken their backs and underarms as they hurried on. Sensing his lead was shrinking, Karl Heinz ran as fast as he was able, but he continued to lose ground, especially to Conrad, the fastest of the three. He turned off the road to go up the hill toward the cemetery, hoping he could outdistance them on the steeper terrain, but he did not. He heard the heavy breath of his pursuers coming closer, ever closer. As he reached the graveyard entrance, he raced down the gravel lane between two rows of tall elm trees. He sped past row after row of neatly manicured plots, many decorated with mementos and flowering shrubs, many memorials with the name Wessel on them. Hilfe, Hilfe, he shouted, though he was sure no one would hear him. No one would come to his aid. He felt his antagonist's hands grasp his shoulders, forcing him to a stop. The stocky, red-faced Conrad spun him around and spit in his face as the two other boys caught up. Take this as a warning, you American rat, you Auslander, Conrad bellowed as he punched Karl Heinz in the stomach and pushed him to the ground. We're watching you, Yankee, he added, kicking Karl Heinz in the side to help make his point. Then he kicked him again and yet again. We're watching you good. Now stand up and show us how to do a proper salute. Fighting the pain in his side and stomach and a strong desire to smash Conrad in the face, Karl Heinz staggered to his feet, thinking he'd better do as they say. He hoped they'd be satisfied and let him go with this warning. Still winded from the run up the steep slope, Karl Heinz could not stand straight, but he managed to raise his right arm towards the heaven. He winced, but shouted as loudly as his laboring lungs would allow, Sieg Heil. Then he grimaced and fell to his hands and knees, his head hanging. Conrad yelled a command to the other two boys, hit this stupid little shicer, pardon my language, so he will know how to show proper respect from now on. Each of the boys delivered a blow, one to Karl Heinz's right shoulder and the other to his left. And with a final kick in the buttocks from Conrad, the three attackers turned their backs on their victim and returned to town. Conrad whistled a marching song to celebrate their stellar accomplishment. The other two boys walked down the hill with him, silently, 2 paces behind their leader. So I had always wanted to know my family's story. It was in 1991 that I finally went back to Germany. My father said, let's go back to Germany. I'll show you my village where I was from. As we came around a curve where the town cemetery was on a hill, he had to pull over. He could not drive another kilometer because he was crying, just total tears. And I said, okay, Dad, talk. We turned off the car engine and it took about half an hour. He told me this story and then started to tell me several others. And after that, he started finally, so I was 40 some years old, and I was finally getting to understand my father a little bit and where he had come from. So he told me a number of the other things that are in the book. But as an Auslander, he was kind of rejected by the kids that he had to be in the German Hitler Youth with. And that changed in the Christmas of 34. My grandfather finally was catching up with his family. So now he's coming home to Germany, and they're moving back for good. They sold everything in New Jersey, in the United States. They had some trepidation because they'd heard about Hitler and the Nazi Party and everything that was going on. They knew their son was now in the Hitler Youth, and they still hoped probably that the Nazi Party would lose its glory and power soon. But they had a family obligation to take care of my great grandparents. So they were moving back. Sort of. Let me just
From
do
David
this
K.
rather than
Wessel
tell you more.
comes Choosing Sides, a novel of historical fiction. Choosing Sides tells the story of an ordinary family torn apart by Hitler's Germany. As the forces of darkness took over their homeland in the 1930s, ordinary Germans faced tough personal choices. Following the path of a German boy named Karl Heinz, in Choosing Sides, we see the weight of an oncoming, savage history, born by a small boy searching for acceptance within a rapidly splintering family. We follow Karl Heinz from his birth in Germany to his move to America at the age of 4, only to move back to a very different Germany in 1934, where Adolf Hitler has become Chancellor. Karl Heinz, like so many young boys at that time, joins the Hitler Youth and through a remarkable turn of events meets Adolf Hitler himself. While some in the family embrace the Third Reich, his parents, Deke and Mimi, are growing increasingly uncomfortable with Germany's political direction and choose to move the family back to the United States. Karl Heinz, approaching 18 years and adulthood, now faces his own choice as he comes to age burdened with life experiences rarely endured by those who are so young. Join Karl Heinz and his loving German family, caught in the maelstrom of passion, allegiances, and war. Choosing Sides.
Becomes a commercial after that. So the day that my grandfather returned to Germany was the day they met Adolf Hitler in person. So my grandfather's first, before he even saw his wife and children, was to meet with Der Fuhrer. He then introduced his wife and children to Adolf Hitler. So that's alluded to. The circumstances are, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about it one-on-one later, but they're kind of unique. But my father, as it came to pass, after they met Adolf Hitler, he was accepted by the other children in the Hitler Youth because they'd never met Der Fuhrer, and now the Wessels have met Adolf himself. So they became sort of easy for them to be, a lot easier for my father to be accepted and welcomed into the Hitler Youth. My father ends up going to the Nuremberg rally in September of 34 before he'd even met Hitler. The Nuremberg rally is the one in Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will movie. His parents, my grandparents, didn't. My grandfather, apparently, the day he met Hitler, shook his hand and said, "Why are we? What are we doing moving back here? This is wrong." It took a while to figure out exactly what to do about it. In the long run, even though he had family obligations to my grandmother's parents, they found someone else who would take over caring for the grandparents, and managed to sell the family household because the grandparents could move out, which gave them a good chunk of cash. My grandfather had made some decent dollars while he was in the United States. So when he decided to leave, he asked everybody named Wessel and everybody named Hornbostel, my grandmother's maiden name. Again, that's 60 aunts and uncles or whatever it is, if they would come with us and come with him back to the United States. He could sponsor them. He could get them, help them find work. He would build them a house because he was a builder. Nobody took him up on it. They all were somewhere on that spectrum. Anyway, they made their choices. So to go back to my original questions of how much ordinary people knew about what was going on and what they chose to do about it, the conclusions that I've come up to are that ordinary Germans knew as much as they wanted to know. If they chose to ignore and overlook things, they could find a rationale or find it in their heart to do so. But if they wanted anything they wanted to know, the information was available. They, as it turns out, 25 kilometers maybe from their house was a concentration camp. They knew people that went to it and never came back. They knew people that went and did come back, so they had opportunity to hear. So like everybody else, they knew what they wanted to do or what they wanted to know. And it's much like for the American side of things, if you ask our American forebears how much they knew about the takeover of the United States from the Native Americans, the indigenous people, or the treatment of African Americans in the United States, we all know as much as we want. It's out there. So I've also come to the conclusion by looking at the historiography and how historians change their viewpoints over the years, that one cannot change the history itself, but our depth of understanding, the new sources of information that become available to us, change our interpretation of the history. So I like to think of a balance between, the history itself is the history. Things happened that happened, or things were done that were done. But how we view them has changed over time. And that pretty much is what I came to say. I'd like to thank you very sincerely for coming out this afternoon. And especially like to thank Tom and the project manager and everybody at the Holocaust Center for New Zealand for their day today and inviting me to speak, and for all of the good work that you're doing to empower, educate, and to remember, educate, and bear witness, I guess is the slogan. And now, time permitting, I'll take on your questions. Again, we'll use the microphone if you're here in the room. Tom is going to let me know if there's some questions from those of you joining us via Zoom. But first, one more slide, and then we'll start. And reminder that there are some copies of the book for sale here. They are $44. If they're $45, I think, on today's exchange rate through Amazon. So we set 44 as the price here. And if you can help support this independent author, that would be great. I'm now working on the follow-up volume of this, is Changing Sides. My father, after World War II, was recruited by the U.S. military intelligence squads to help extract German scientists from the Russian-occupied portions of Austria. So that's a whole different story, but that I'm working on now. But anyway, so questions, please, from Tom from the internet or here in the room. Yes, sir. Oh.
I don't know if this one. I don't know if it's a question or comment, but I never understood the stuff you were talking about. I sort of always assumed that it was friends of people and the rest of it. But being I'm an American as well, I see some parallels in what's going on today in the States. Of course, there's no immediate horror, but look what's going on, and look at the reaction. Do you see the scenario?
David, people on Zoom asking to repeat the question. They missed the first part.
Okay, the question is basically, are there not a number of parallels between Germany in the 1930s and the United States in the current era, or the world in the current era? And yes, this has been brought to my attention many times. I did not write this as a political statement. I wanted my family history to speak for itself. But there are a number of people have told me there are a number of parallels between what ordinary Germans were going through, or what German society was going through, and what American society is going through, the polarization, the nationalism, anti-religious dogmas, whether it's anti-Muslim in the United States or anti-Jewish in the United States, and worldwide radicalization. So yes, there are obvious parallels, and hopefully we learn from the past. One of Benjamin Carter Hett's phrases when he and I talked was that we have the benefit of knowing where this can go. Hopefully we use that knowledge. So, yes, ma'am.
Sorry. That's right. All right. So 3 questions. So first of all, did your father speak German with his parents extensively at home when he was in the United States?
So question 1 is, did my father speak German when he was a child at home with his parents? And no, in the United States, they spoke only English because they had left Germany. They wanted to be American. They wanted their children to be American. At least after they left the second time, in that 7-year period that my father was growing up, they gradually, from what I understand, switched from speaking mostly German to speaking only English. So hence my father had that American accent when he went back.
Okay. The second question is, did any of your German relations come to America after the war?
Question is whether, if you can hear it, whether any of my German relations came to the United States after. And to the best of my knowledge, no. Some went to Australia, including my great uncle Ernst, who had been the Nazi Party official 2 or 3 days after Hitler's suicide. He moved. He had the opportunity to leave Germany, and he chose to do so for his own benefit. That's hard to try to figure out. I know he changed his name. I know where he went, and I know some of his some of his descendants. But nobody else moved to America post World War II. Some came to visit, but.
And the third question is, how difficult was it to travel between the United States and Germany when your parents left in both directions?
So how difficult was it for my parents to travel in either direction during their travels back and forth? It was really quite easy. The first time when they left in 1927, there were no restrictions other than what you could afford. So they traveled in what I call steerage, third class on the way to the United States. When my grandmother moved back with my father back to Germany in 1934, my grandfather had done quite well financially, so they were traveling second class. Maybe, but he traveled separately. Now he came back second class. They came back first class, the family. And then in 1934, they had moved back. That's when they met Adolf Hitler, and my grandfather apparently shook hands with Adolf Hitler and felt a chill up his spine and said, nope, we're moving. Nope, we're moving back. And that was in March of 1935. And none of the other family would come with him. So again, he could afford a first class passage. So it's very fortunate for my family that, for my immediate family, that it was relatively easy. They were not Jewish, by the way, so they didn't have to face any discrimination when it came to buying an exit visa. Other questions from Tom, maybe?
Yeah. It's not from the chat, it's actually from me. All my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, but none are from Germany. They're all from occupied countries, from France, from Poland, from Hungary. I always thought that the ordinary people in Germany the Hitler regime was quite benefit to them. So my question is not really, when I'm thinking what would they do, what could they do, I'm usually thinking what should they do? And also if I was, like you said, if my main goal is to make sure that my kids are safe and their economic future is safe, should I do anything if it's not coming to me?
Right. Yeah, for my own family of ordinary folks, as far as I know, my grandparents were the only two that chose to leave, and had the money and the opportunity to do so. Most of those X number of aunts and uncles that my father had stayed. Some joined the Wehrmacht. Some of the men, because they were patriotic Germans, ended up in the Wehrmacht. I only know about the one who became a good believer Nazi. But the others, large number of the Wessels and Hornbussells, my grandmother's maiden name, were factory and farm workers, so they were valuable to the Reich in their place. So they could, the brickworks and cement works became necessities for building all the wonderful structures that Adolf Hitler saw building. So a number of them had the opportunity to work for the good of the party, for the good of the Third Reich, but in their own occupation. My own family was, because there were a lot of farmers in the family, they had access to food that a lot of Germans, especially towards the end of the war, during rationing, etc., they didn't suffer nearly as much as many of the other Germans would have living in a war economy. So that's what they did do. It's a very hard question for me to discuss with the five, I think it's about 5 cousins that I keep in touch with, that my German is so-so, their English is so-so, getting into the deep philosophical moral questions about, well, what did your parents think and do, becomes a little bit difficult for us. So that's why I've kind of, I keep up the effort, but I'm not sure I'll ever have the answer.
I mean, right now, we already know that in Berlin by itself, in the end of the war, there were between 6,000 to 7,000 Jews that were hidden in homes of Germans. So we know that, how did you say, who wasn't compliance? That some of them did chose to actively resist.
Yeah, right. That's a good, a natural or a positive form of resistance that came with some danger would be hiding another family or sneaking food into another family. If you knew there was a Jewish family, the Jewish families in Berlin had no ration cards for 8 months, I think, prior to the end of the war. But they still had to eat. So there were neighbors and friends probably who took them rations. That's why this book, Staying Alive, is revealing some of their stories to me. Even though I haven't finished it, I highly recommend it.
I have here another question. Given that media was mainly print and radio at the time, what option did the resistance use to reach other Germans? Were there alternative to state-controlled media?
Within Germany, there was access to the BBC from London for a number of people that kept radios hidden and at risk would play news from London, which gave them a slightly different set of propaganda, probably because the press, the BBC, was influenced by the British government, but not quite as controlled, obviously, as the German radio or the German press. I believe there was one active Jewish newspaper kept during almost the entirety of the war, but it was monitored heavily by Goebbels and the propaganda machine, and used. Even though there was one, I'm pretty sure there was one Jewish newspaper left, but it put out messages that the Nazi Party wanted Jews to receive. So it wasn't really a balanced press. It was. I wish I could read German well enough to read some of the articles, just to see how they were writing to a Jewish audience with German propaganda in mind. I'm speaking to a German translator, English to German, so that it's not out yet. I don't have an audible version yet, but the same narrator of this film is working on an audio version. But I hope to. It's not an inexpensive thing to get it translated correctly so that it's grammatically correct. And my publisher and I disagree on who's going to pay for all that, but but we're working on it. One question, microphone is being taken to the back.
I did have a question, and when you talked about the reason that people were living were sharing with each other, what they would say is bleiben Sie übrig, which means be the one that stays.
Oh, okay.
That's the greeting that you could call.
What's the meaning again?
Bleiben Sie übrig. Bleiben means stay.
Mm-hmm.
Remaining.
Okay. Stay remaining. So, okay. The author of this audiobook that I'm on translated it a little bit differently.